I'm going to grab that table. That's fine. Well, hello, everybody. As I get ready up here, I'll introduce myself. My name is DJ Jellison. I'm not one of the pastors here. But I did join the launch team back in 2020, and every now and then, Chris needs to take a sabbatical, so he asked me to come up here. And I used to be a teacher, so this is fun. I'm a little nervous, but David told me that whenever I get nervous, just picture everybody in the room naked, which sounds pretty sinful, so I'm just... Woo! So I'm just not going to get nervous. All right. All right, everybody. Well, I'm just really happy to be up here because I love to teach, and it's been a long time since I've been in front of the classroom or I've been in the position of teaching. So have a lot to say. I feel like God has put a lot on my heart today, so let's just get right into it. So the King is coming. There is a king coming, and the Bible is pretty clear about this. The prophet Isaiah declared this about 700 years prior to the arrival of the king. And that's where we're going to pick up. We're going to pick up in the book of Isaiah. It's chapter 7, verse 14. So you guys, if you have a Bible in front of you, turn to Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. You can type to or turn to, and it will also be on the screen right behind me. It says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Immanuel." Now, Immanuel is a Hebrew word that translates to God with us. God with us. And today's message is unique because we're not talking about a specific passage, though I did just read a specific passage, but we're also not talking about a specific story in the Bible. More so, we're talking about a theme of the Bible, and it is a major theme of the Bible. And it is this idea or this concept that God is with us. That God is with us. And you see this spoken about by the prophet Isaiah. There is a king coming, and he is coming to be with us. Now, I enjoy gospel conversations. I enjoy having talks about people's worldviews. I enjoy apologetics. And over the years, especially when we moved to Pittsburgh, I've had a lot of conversations with disconnected people. And it doesn't really matter how the conversation starts. Inevitably, it gets to the idea, does God exist or not? And there are some people out there that just do not believe. They just flat out don't believe that God exists. But most of the people that I've talked to, though they are disconnected from God, they do deposit a belief in something. They believe that God exists and he created everything. He's just a distant God. And he's far away. He created everything and then he left. And he doesn't really care about the goings-ons on earth, and he's not involved in our lives here on earth. There's a lot of folks that believe that. Well, if you're a scholar of the Bible, that's just simply not true. In fact, one of the major themes of the Bible, as I said, is this idea that God is with us. He does desire to be with us. You go to the first chapter, or the first chapters of the Bible in Genesis, and you see God walking in the garden with Adam and Eve. He is with them. And then you fast forward to the Old Testament, and you see in the Exodus, as they are leaving Egypt, God, as you can see in the next slide, Dom, thanks. You can see in this picture up here that God is leading them by a cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. It's God being with them. You fast forward. It's the reason for the creation of the tabernacle, and it is the reason later for the creation of the temple. It's like, why were those created? It was created so that God could have a dwelling place on earth with us. Fast forward, obviously, the birth of Jesus. Jesus is coming to earth to be with us. It's the reason why he came. It's the reason why he died. It's the reason why he rose again. And it's the reason, ultimately, that he is coming back. God has a desire to have a forever with us. His major theme in the Bible. This is a weighty topic, and it's one that we will go into depth discussing today. But when I was first approached to talk about this topic, it's like, okay, what's the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of the concept God with us? And the first thing I thought about was a story that happened last year, actually. If you know anything about me, you know that I'm a giant Pitt football fan, okay? Well, another thing about me is that when we moved to Pittsburgh, we moved from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And last year, Pitt football played Wake Forest, which is located in Winston-Salem. And I told Brittany, I said, this is a perfect opportunity for us to go back to Winston, see our friends, bring Felicity down, our daughter, so they could meet our friends from North Carolina, and ultimately go to the game. Now, Wake Forest is a tiny school. I don't even know how they qualify to be Division I because they're so small. Winston-Salem is a very small city, so I thought this is going to be perfect. We're going to go to the game. Felicity's going to have so much room to run around if she gets bored, and it's going to be fun. Little did I know, number one, it was homecoming week, and I couldn't believe how many people were at the stadium. It was a nightmare. Parking was a nightmare. The seats were a nightmare. And then to top it off, Felicity, which we did not know at the time, had COVID. But this is a picture of me and Felicity at the stadium. She was a trooper. She really was. She enjoyed herself. But as the day progressed, we started to realize that she was showing symptoms, and then Brittany started showing symptoms as well, and it was just a terrible time. Well, to make matters worse, we go back to the Airbnb, and now poor Felicity, who is, she's a firecracker, if you know her, but when she's sick, she's just such a sweet little girl. And we get back to the Airbnb, and of course, she doesn't know the house. She doesn't know the room. It's not her crib, and she feels terrible. So I go to put her in her packing play, and I can just tell that she's not feeling well. She's scared. She's hurting. And I knew that she just didn't want to be alone. So I got a pillow and I got a blanket, and I set myself down on the floor pretty much underneath her pack and play, and I just stayed there. And she fell asleep. But periodically through the night, Felicity would get up, and she would peer over the slats of her pack and play, and she would say, "Dada?" And she would just look to make sure that I was still there. And I would say, "Yeah, Felicity, I'm still here, honey. I didn't leave." And she would just collapse back down, go to sleep. She did that probably 4 or 5 times throughout the night. She would just stand up, look out into the dark room just to make sure that Daddy was still with her. And guys, I don't tell you that story because I want to be Dad of the Year or I want to virtue signal. I'm telling you that story because it's relatable. And it's both relatable to you and me. I have been there and you have been there. You have been in the worst moment of your life. You have felt terrible in that moment, and a lot of you probably felt confused as to what was going on. Because sometimes you might not know what is going on, but what you do know is that it's not right. Something is wrong. And the one thing that you want most is that there is somebody there who does understand. There's somebody there that deeply loves you and can empathize with you and who isn't going to leave you alone. And I think that is at the heart of this theme of God with us, is that God is with us, He can empathize with us, and He deeply loves us, and He's here with us right now. But I think before we go into depth with this, we have to just go back to that childlike faith. It's a simple thing, and the simple thing is that we have to approach this just like a 1.5-year-old girl approached it, that when we are in our lowest, we can look out into the dark room and say, "God, are you still with me?" And if we believe that Jesus is who He says He is, then our anxiety falls away when He is in the room. So we go back to the scripture. It says, "Therefore, the Lord Himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and we will call Him Immanuel." Well, right off the bat, the skeptic in the room would obviously say that this scripture is not talking about Jesus, because Jesus is not named Immanuel. And that's fair. That's a fair criticism. And if you're even a scholar of the Bible and you go to Joseph and Mary, when Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant, he wants to leave her. And then he has a vision that night, and the angel tells him, no, Mary is with child because the Spirit of God is in her. She's going to give birth to a son, and you're going to name him Jesus. It's like, ah. So the skeptic in the room looks at this and says, well, it can't possibly be talking about Jesus because you have an inconsistency there. Okay, that's fair. But it's really easy to look beyond that. It's like if we just, take it a little bit further. You see, we name people things based off of who they are and what they do. And just to give you an example of this, when Brittany and I, before we were even married, just in our dating years, we told each other that if we ever had a son, we were going to name him Wesley. Because that's my middle name, and Brittany always liked that name, and I like it too. So we always knew that if we ever had a son, we were going to name him Wesley. So in the hospital room, the first time we saw Wesley, we didn't know we were having a boy. We saw him, we were like, oh, his name is Wesley. But the first time I saw him, I immediately looked at him and said, he is my little big. And the women in the room are laughing because they know that he is little, but he's big. He's little because he's a baby, but he's a big baby, okay? He's a big baby. He's 7 months old. He's already 20 pounds, okay? I mean, I don't know if you've seen me, but I'm pretty big myself, But his name is not his name is not Little Big. His name is Wesley. We call him Little Big because that's what he is. Jesus is named Jesus, but we call him Immanuel because that is both who he is and what he is. And this concept of God with us, if we take it a little bit further, it's extremely significant. Extremely significant because this concept of God with us separates Christianity from all other religions. All other religions, man perceives and pursues God. But Christianity is radically different. Christianity is the only religion where God becomes human. It's the total opposite. It's God perceives and pursues man. We get back to what Chris was talking about in his sermon last week. It's incarnate. Jesus Christ is the incarnate God. Incarnate translates to in the flesh. It is a radical thing to think that a God that is so glorified and powerful would become human. So you have to remember, there was a time where human beings couldn't even look at the face of God without dying, and now all of that power and holiness and glory is coming to earth to be seated in flesh. It's radically different, but it says a lot about him. He is literally with us in the flesh. At Steel City Church, we study the Bible, and while we study the Bible, we ask ourselves two main questions. And if you've done any reading plans with us, if you show up on Tuesday nights, we ask the same questions every single time we read the Bible. Question number one, what does this passage teach us about God? Question number two, what does this passage teach us about ourselves? So for the rest of the time today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to focus on those two questions. We're going to focus on the first one. What does this idea of God with us, what does it teach us about God? And I think it teaches us three things, three important things that I want to talk about. I'm going to do this very quickly. Number one, I think it teaches us that God keeps his promises. God keeps his promises because if you go back all the way back to Genesis, before Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, God gives them a promise. And he says, I promise to you that I'm going to send a son into the world. He is going to be born of a woman, and he is going to be your deliverer. He's going to crush the head of the snake, defeat evil, and deliver you. That was a promise that he made back in Genesis. We fast forward to the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah, 700 years before the king leaves his throne to be born in a manger, doubles down on God's promises and says, yes, you're going to yes, I'm sending a son into the world. He's going to be born of a virgin, and he's going to be God with you. So God keeps his promises. The second thing is also pretty simple. It just shows us that God deeply loves us. God gave his first and only. He sacrificed his first and only son, sent his son into the world to be killed. You only do that if you deeply love the ones that you're sacrificing. For Jesus gave up the throne in heaven. There's no metaphor significant enough or sufficient enough to explain how far he had to come to do that. It's like, I was limitless, I came to be limited. And Jesus deeply loved us, and that's why he came to be with us. And the last thing is just simple. He shows up. God shows up. Jesus shows up. And he shows up in inconvenient and uncomfortable circumstances. Obviously, he left a throne to be born into a feeding trough. But you look at the life of Jesus, he also shows up. Jairus asks him, "My daughter is dying. Will you please come to her?" Jesus drops everything, goes to her bedside. The sisters of Lazarus, Mary and Martha, they send for him and say, "Jesus, if you were here, my brother wouldn't be dead." And Jesus drops everything, and he goes to the grave side, and he consoles Mary and Martha. It tells us a lot about God that he shows up. And I think that just some of us, just a side note, I think some of us just need to hear that because we need to do that. We need to show up. We need to show up in the important circumstances in our life that we otherwise are not. It's like I'm speaking to myself. I feel like I need to show up and serve more at Steel City Church. But for some of you, you just need to show up to your D group. It's like it's been months where your D group hasn't met consistently because you just don't make time to show up. You don't make time for God. You don't make time for your brothers and sisters in Christ. It's like, show up. Fulfill your commitments. Some of you, it's in other areas of your life. It's like you need to show up to your work's Christmas party and be the only Christian in the room and have conversations with people. And it's like, guys, your wives are silently asking the question, when are you going to show up in our marriage? When are you going to show up and lead our household and make decisions? It's like they are drowning trying to take care of your children because the only place you're showing up is at work. It's like put the Xbox controller down and pick up your children. I went to a Man Up conference with David a couple years ago, and I learned this fascinating story about Mike Tomlin, the coach of the Steelers. Mike Tomlin goes to a chorus concert down on the North Shore. A bunch of teenage girls were doing a chorus concert through Urban Impact. And he shows up, and after the concert, the girls are backstage, and they're giddy, and they're crying, and they're so happy. And the director of the chorus concert says, "Girls, I didn't know that you loved football so much." And the girls look at him, and they're like, "No, it's not because he's Mike Tomlin. He's the only man that has ever come to any of our events." It's like, guys, Jesus showed up in inconvenient ways when they were uncomfortable, and he changed people's lives doing so. It's like, and I'm not trying to tell you guys to be Jesus. I'm telling you to be like Jesus. Like, fulfill your commitments. Show up. That was just my little side note there. But moving on, as I get lost in my notes here. So that's what we learn about God, but what do we learn? Let's make this transition. Let's talk about ourselves now. So what do we learn about ourselves? What does this concept, God with us, what does it teach us about me? Well, some of the mottos at Steel City Church are, we sacrifice to invite others in. We go to those who won't come to us. It's like, well, why do we have these mottos? Is it to complete a fill in the blank on our website? Is it to say how special we are? It's like, no, it's because one of the other things at Steel City Church that is important to us is that we want to learn and live the ways of Jesus. Well, you can't learn and live the ways of Jesus unless you know the ways of Jesus. We want to sacrifice to invite others in because we first saw Jesus sacrifice himself to invite us into his kingdom. We want to go to those who won't come to us because we first saw Jesus leave his throne to come to earth because we could never cross that distance and go to him. Jesus made sacrifices, and he sacrificed tremendously for us. So our mind can't actually comprehend how much of a sacrifice he gave to us. But sacrifice is just simply not popular, especially in the American church. Like, we are so obsessed with our individuality and our sovereignty. It's like, ugh, I don't want to give my time, talent, and treasure. Like, I don't want to wake up early and serve. I don't want to give my money away. It's like, ugh, I don't want to sacrifice anything. It's so inconvenient and absurd to us to think about sacrificing. It's like, I guess if you want to live your life that way, where you're just, obsessed with yourself and you just agonizingly make everything about you, that's fine. But that is not the way of Jesus Christ. Like, Jesus sacrificed his rights when he left heaven. And he didn't have to. He didn't have to become a man. He didn't have to become a baby. But it's like, if we want to focus on ourselves, let's stop and let's do that for a little bit. Leading up to writing my sermon, I asked God what every pastor should ask: what do you want me to say? And it's like so clear, so clear. God said, DJ, I want you to tell them that I came to be with them or with you. It's so easy to get caught up in that because the word us is plural. It's like, yeah, God came with us. It's like, yeah, that's true. But what you need to know is that he came for you. It's like, yeah, Jesus died on the cross to be sacrificed for the world. It's like, that's true, but you need to know that he died on the cross for you. It's so easy to forget that. It's like backspace, delete the word us, insert the word me, and believe it. It's one thing we learn about this is that he came to be with me, with you. It's like, okay, let's just look at the nativity scene, okay? Because we put this up last week. It's like, what a perfect picture of this concept. Jesus coming to be with us, incarnate, in the flesh. It's like, let's look at the nativity scene. It's like, okay, well, why was Jesus born a baby? Because you were born a baby. It's like, well, why did he shiver in the cold? And it's like, well, because you shivered when you're cold. And you needed somebody to take care of you in every aspect of your life. Well, then you look deeper at it, and you're like, why are there animals? And why is there hay? And where are the doctors? And where are the blankets? Where are the pillows? It's like, well, yeah, it makes sense to ask that because you had all of those things. But Jesus didn't have all of those things because he had to come lower than you so that he could pick you up and fully lift you higher. It's like, have you ever tried to lift somebody up who has fallen down and can't get up on their own? You don't lift them up by standing over them. The only way you can do that is to get down to their level and get under them and lift them up. And that is what Jesus did. He didn't have to suffer because he didn't have to suffer through sickness. He didn't have to get some hard manual labor job. He didn't have to live in poverty. He didn't have to be spat on, ridiculed, rejected. He didn't have to be whipped and marred. He certainly didn't have to die. He didn't need any of that. But you did. You actually needed all of that. Chris mentioned last week that the coming king was coming to be a substitute He's coming to be a substitute. That's the second thing we learn about ourselves, is that I need a substitute. It's like, you guys need to fully come on board with this. It's like, stop telling yourself, I just need a second chance. Like, no. You don't need a second chance. You need a substitute. And the only way that you can have a substitute is for God to literally come to earth to be your substitute. It's really difficult to appreciate the fullness of Christ until you understand the complete emptiness without him. It's like, all right, close your eyes, stop looking at me. I want you to try to picture this. I want you to try to, in your mind, picture the worst day in all of history, okay? The worst day in what may very well be the single worst moment in the history of the human race. Adam and Eve, standing outside the Garden of Eden. They're banished, and they're looking in, and there's an angel standing there with a sword that's on fire, guaranteeing that they will never enter the garden again, guaranteeing that they will never have those intimate walks with God anymore, that they won't enjoy the thornless grounds, they won't enjoy the delicious fruit from the tree of life. They are banished, and now all they have are these feelings of nagging, haunting emotions of guilt and fear. The consequences of their decisions were catastrophic, not only for themselves, but for everybody who would follow after them. And they're standing outside the garden in complete and utter shame because they are banished from God. Guys, it shouldn't be that difficult for us to imagine that, because the Bible tells us that at some point in our lives and in your lives, you were cut off. You were banished. You were alienated. But then Jesus shows up, and he shows up in your life, and he shows up to be your substitute. It's like Jesus had to live your life in every aspect. Like, he had to know what it felt like to be sick. He had to know what it felt like to be hurt. He had to know what temptation was like. He had to know what anger and despair felt like. It's like he had to live your life as a baby and as a child and as an adult, because he had to succeed in all the ways that you fail. He is a substitute for you. But some of us don't believe this. Some of us have a hard time believing this. It's like the idea of thinking that God is with us, that's fine, but I can't make the connection that God's with me. We can easily get lost in the room, you know? It's like, yeah, God's with us, but he's not with me. And we think that it's so selfish of us to think of it that way. It's like, it's selfish for me to say that God came for me. It's like, no. Like, what's more selfish is for you to think that you are unique in human history and that you're the only person on earth to ever live where the God of everything from the burning of stars to the molecules in the ocean is not powerful enough or able to come to earth strictly to be with you and to save you. Like, that's what's selfish. It's like, it's not selfish because the gospel is both humiliating and encouraging at the same time. It's like, you are so wicked in your heart that God had to come to earth and die for you. While at the same time, you have so much intrinsic value that God left everything in heaven to come and be with you. That's what the gospel is. But sometimes, God doesn't show up in the ways that we think he should. And we tell ourselves he either doesn't love me or he's not here. I don't think Chris would allow me to come on stage today unless I quoted my favorite author. Like my D group is there like, yes. My favorite author is C.S. Lewis. He's most widely known for his Chronicles of Narnia, which is a children's book that Lewis wrote to introduce the gospel to his niece. If you have not read the Chronicles of Narnia, there's a library down on Irvine Street. And I believe they probably carry it. But I'm going to talk about one of the stories. It's called A Horse and His Boy. It's one of the stories in the Chronicle series. And the boy's name is Shasta. And Shasta has a terrible life. I mean, it's just horrible. And there's a scene where he's walking in a cave, and it's dark, and he's in this cave. And he's walking, but he feels that there's somebody there with him. He's like, oh, I'm not alone. I can feel somebody breathing in the room. I can hear the footsteps of somebody walking with me. So Shasta speaks out to the presence in the room, and the presence answers him and says, I've been waiting for you to speak, child. Tell me your sorrows. And Shasta's like, how much time do you have? And he just opens up, and he says, well, first off, I never knew my parents. Never knew my father. And I was brought up sternly by this fisherman. And then when I escaped the fisherman, I found a horse, I escaped the fisherman, and I was chased by a lion. This lion chased me, and he chased me all the way down to the water's edge, where then I had to get in the water and swim for my life. And then after that, I had all these troubles, and then it took me to a cemetery, and I was surrounded by the tombs of the dead, and there were these jackals and wolves, and they were all howling at me, trying to get to me, and there was this creepy cat that kept coming out of the tomb, and he wouldn't leave me alone. And then after that, I was chased again by another lion who wounded my horse. And the voice says, I don't think that you're unfortunate. And Shasta goes, what? Don't you think that it's a little unlucky to be chased by so many lions? And the voice goes, well, there was only one lion. And Shasta goes, okay, you're not listening. I clearly told you that there were at least 2 lions. And the voice stops him and says, there was only one lion. He was just swift of foot. And Shasta goes, how do you know? And the voice says, I was the lion. I was the lion who forced you to join your horse, Aravis. I was that cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses new strength of fear so they could go the last mile fast enough for you to reach the king in time. And I was the lion that you don't remember, who pushed the boat in which you laid, a child near death, so that it came to shore where a man sat wakeful at midnight, ready to receive you. It gives me goosebumps now, and it is the only time that I've ever read something other than the Bible that has made me close the book and look up and go, wow, how powerful is that? And it's powerful because there's times in our lives where we feel like we're being chased by lions. And sometimes we fall down and we fail and we get frustrated and we have times of sorrow and times where we just want to cry out in pain because we feel that God has forsaken us. And God lets all of that stuff happen to us. Like he lets us go through the toughest times in our life, in the darkest times in our life, because he knows that that's the best way for us to grow closer to him. And it's that growth and that deep learning that most of the time confuses us. It's this mystery where we feel forsaken, but we actually aren't. It's those times that also bring us the greatest joy. Because when we find ourselves in the storm that is raging and we cry out to God, we can barely hear his whisper through the rain, I'm with you. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear not, for you are with me. My wife Brittany and I just started doing a reading plan together. It's not a new plan, it's an old plan. It's the F260 plan. If you were on the original launch team with us, it was the first thing we did in D groups back in the summer of 2020. So we're reading it together, and it's fun because she shares her notes from back then, and I share my notes from back then. And it's fascinating to see how the Word convicted us 4 years ago. But the greater context to it is that time was the worst time in my wife's life. Because at that time, she was grieving the sudden and tragic loss of her father. And the first night that we sit down to do this reading plan, she shows me a note that she wrote 4 years ago for her eyes only. And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever read from her. The 13 years of love letters and poems, like what she wrote for herself in God. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever read from her. And she says this, she goes, God was with me before I was even thought of. God has always hovered over my life and will always do so. His Spirit is always present, and thus He can speak life into my situation, no matter how dark or formless it may seem. And it's such a beautiful thing to watch her grow so close to God in a time where she at the same time felt forsaken. And I just think it's divine. That's why I'm sharing it with you. It's like, I never would have read that. But then 2 weeks before I'm asked to give a sermon on God with us, I read that. Something that she wrote 4 years ago. Todd Beamer was a passenger on United 93. United 93 was the fourth hijacked plane on September 11, 2001. The interesting thing about Todd was that he was able to do what most people weren't. He was able to make connection with the ground via phone call. And he talked to an emergency dispatcher on the ground. Her name was Lisa, which was interestingly the same name of his wife. So that gave him some comfort. And it's on the phone with Lisa where he learns that his plane's not the only hijacked plane, and in fact, the other planes had been used as projectiles and the World Trade Center had been destroyed. So Todd tells Lisa of a plan that he and the other passengers had put together that they were going to take the plane back. And before the line is disconnected, the last things that Todd Beamer can be heard saying is he asks Lisa, will you pray with me on the phone? And she says, of course. So together they recite the Lord's Prayer. And then they recite the 23rd Psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And then right before the line is disconnected, Todd Beamer is heard saying, God be with me. Jesus is with me. And then apparently he turns to the other passengers and says, are you ready? Let's roll. And then the line is disconnected. And Jesus is in the seat next to you. He's the one walking down the aisle of your darkest moments. He's in the stairwell of your finest or your final moments on earth. And it's this idea that you will never be alone. It's the third thing we learn is that I will never be alone. Jesus does not conquer or did not conquer in spite of suffering. He conquers through it. We'll turn back to one more piece of scripture before we end today. It's out of the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 3. We pick up in verse 19. Little context. 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they're Jewish men. They refuse a decree from King Nebuchadnezzar to bow down and worship an idol. King says, you don't bow down and worship my idol, I'm throwing you into a furnace. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, I'm never going to do that. God will save me from the furnace, but even if he doesn't, I will never bow down to your idol. So we pick up in verse 19. It says, Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in the pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell in to the roaring flames. But suddenly, King Nebuchadnezzar jumps up in amazement, and he exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did. Well, look, I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed. And the 4th one looks like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace, and he shouts, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego step out of the fire. And the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowd around them. They see that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their clothing was not scorched. And they didn't even smell of smoke. It's like the book of Daniel was written 600 years before Jesus was born. And it's like it takes us back to that picture of you and me, a child like Felicity, looking over the crib into the dark room and saying, God, where are you? Are you still with me? And in the darkness, you hear his response, and he says, yes, child, I'm still here. I've always been here. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you, for I am with you always. And it's true that at one point you were alienated. You were cut away, and you were thrown into the furnace. But I went in with you. And while I loosened your bindings, I protected you from the fire, and when you stepped out, I stayed in. It's like not even the gates of hell can keep those down who have God on their side. It reminds me of those lyrics to the favorite song, there is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come what may in the space between all the things unseen and this reckoning, and I know that I will never be alone. There will be another in the fire, standing next to me. There'll be another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding of how good you have been to me, I'll count the joy come every battle, because I know that's where you'll be. In preparation for this sermon, I read a sermon by Charles Spurgeon. So to wrap up today, I'm going to just, right from the horse's mouth. He says this, he goes, Jesus has been with us in it all. Do you feel the sorrows of poverty? Jesus had nowhere to leave his head. Do you endure the griefs of bereavement? Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus. Have you been slandered for righteousness' sake, and has it vexed your spirit? Well, Jesus said, reproach hath broken my heart. Have you been betrayed? Well, don't forget that Jesus too had a familiar friend who sold him for the price of a slave. On what stormy sea have you been tossed, which has not also roared against his boat? Never has there been a glen of adversity so dark, deep, or pathless that when you stoop down, you see the footprints of the crucified one. In the fires and in the rivers, on the cold nights and under the burning sun, he cries, I am with thee, be not dismayed, for I am both your companion and your God. And let's pray. God, we are so humbled to know that you are with us on the mountain and in the valley, that you have never left us, nor will you ever forsake us. And God, we cling to this promise that you give us from the days of ancient times, this promise to be with us through it all, to deliver us through all the things that we suffer through, and to know that we can conquer, that we can overcome, and that we shall live because you live. God, we are humbled to come here together to be in your presence and to worship and praise you. And it's in